Alrighty, well, thank you, Hannah, and thank you to all the attendees. If you are unfamiliar, my name is Annie Carter, and I am the Education Programs Manager with Colorado Canyons Association. We are essentially the friends group for Colorado's 3 national conservation areas, McInnes Canyons, Dominguez Escalante, and the Gunnison Gorge. We are lucky enough to have all 3 of those areas on the western slope, and we engage the local communities through education, outreach, and stewardship of those landscapes. This winter sort of season lecture series aims to share relevant research as well as in-depth views on a certain topic, like what we're going to be listening to tonight. So Hannah is joining us. She is the Southwest Region Associate Director for Policy with American Rivers. I actually met Hannah at an event through Conservation Colorado, a panel. I think I went up to you at the end there, but talking about water in the West. So thank you for lending us your expertise tonight. Some of you might be familiar with Hannah's work at Colorado Mesa University. She co-founded and directed the Hutchins Water Center up until 2022, and I'm sure has just been doing this amazing work in the field of rivers and education and promoting just kind of this awareness about what we all need to think about going into a more uncertain future with water, but also a climate now where we can be communicating and educating folks so well. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. If you have questions, Hannah is interested in answering questions throughout her presentation, so feel free to put those in the chat. I'm going to be kind of moderating those questions. If you'd like to save them until the end, you can put that in the Q&A, and we'll answer those questions at the end too. So feel free to use either method. And Hannah, I'll just kind of pop in to address some of those questions with you.
That sounds great. And I know just from who I've seen in the chat so far, I know there are some other folks who have a lot of expertise on the topics I'm going to be talking about as well. So please, if you want to add something to what I'm saying, feel free to add that in the chat too. And I'm happy to have help with my presentation. So
great. All right, I'm going to turn myself off and hand it to you, Hannah. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So it looks like that's all set there. Let me know if you have any trouble seeing it. What I'm going to talk about today is river flows through the Grand Valley, how snow, history, and law shape what we see in our rivers through the Grand Valley and, upstream also in Delta County and through our area. So my current position is as you just heard that I'm Associate Director for Policy in the Southwest Program for American Rivers. And American Rivers is a national organization that works to protect and restore rivers for people and nature. But I'm based here in Grand Junction, and I'm focused mostly on the Colorado River and the Colorado Basin in general. So what I am, let's see here. There we go. So just to give you an idea of where I'm headed with my presentation today, we'll talk a little bit about snow and topography in the basin and how that affects our hydrographs, so the flows that we see in the river. Then get into our history of settlement, all the ditches and reservoirs we built and how that affects flows in our rivers, and then the role that environmental laws play, especially the Endangered Species Act. And I don't have it on the outline here, but I'm also prepared to talk a little bit about some of the current challenges that are facing the river and our communities. So that's where I'll be going today. So this is a map that, especially the one on the left, if you go to very many river presentations at all, you've probably seen this, but I think it's always worthwhile to look at it. So the Colorado River Basin, and of course we are right here at the confluence of the Colorado and the Gunnison Rivers in this big river basin. So I used to teach a 100 level class for Colorado Mesa University students on water, people, and the environment. So I would show them this slide and I would ask them to think about what they see here in terms of topography and what the landscape is like. And also the extra kind of shading outside of the basin that shows that not only do we live in a pretty dry basin, but without a lot of water in it, but we also export the water that we do have to other places, and that all has bearing on the flows in the river. On the right-hand side, you can see just how arid the basin really is. A good chunk of it, including the part that we live in right here, gets less than 10 inches of precipitation per year. So most of the water that's in the whole river really comes from these blue and green areas, which are Colorado's mountains, and a little bit also from Wyoming and Utah. This kind of high country really contributes the lion's share of the flows we see in the river and the water that's used outside the basin. So we do have, given that topography and that most of the water comes from those high mountains, we do have a primarily snowmelt driven hydrograph. And this just shows flows over the past year near the Colorado-Utah state line. So you can see that 2023 flows are in this dark blue color, pretty nice year for flows. You can see the year before, which was a lot lower, and you can see the median flows also, so in between those two. So even just in 2 years, you can get a sense for the variability that we experience on the Colorado River where we live, and just how different it can be from year to year, and also this rhythm that I think most of us are pretty familiar with of, fairly low flows going through the winter, and then the snow starts to melt and it really picks up. And then it gradually drops off as that snowpack diminishes and we go back to low flow conditions. So that still forms the kind of basic, that's still the main driver of the flows that we see in the river. But we've also done a bunch of things to complicate that in the last, 100 to 150 years that white settlement has been in this area. We have done a lot of digging of ditches and irrigating and building dams and reservoirs and all kinds of things. So this gives a sense for some of the key infrastructure and development that we've done on the Colorado River Basin here. So you can see some of the key. Grand Lake is a natural lake, but it's also become part of this reservoir system that sends a good chunk of water over the hill to northeastern Colorado. And then you have Dillon Reservoir here that also taps Colorado River headwaters. We have Green Mountain Reservoir, which is the reservoir that our irrigators in the Grand Valley draw on, and that also provides a lot of water for endangered fish. These other reservoirs here, Rudai Reservoir, and you can see another really important feature of the Colorado River Basin that has a big impact on flows and that's been in the news quite a bit lately is the Shoshone hydroelectric power plant right here in the middle. And that is important largely because of our Colorado system of water law, which the basic outlines of which we share with most other arid Western states, which is it's a prior appropriation system. So the older your water right is, the higher priority it has. And in dry times, the latecomers get cut off until the seniors are satisfied. So the reason that this has been in the news so much recently is that it's a very old water right. 1908 sticks in my head, but I'm not 100% sure about that. And it's super important on the river because it is older than all of these trans-mountain diversions. And it calls a good chunk of water down the river. So it limits how much can get taken over the hill. And then it doesn't use the water up. It dries up about 3 miles, I think, of the Colorado River. But then after the water goes through those those turbines, it goes straight back into the river. So it plays a really important role in keeping water in the river upstream, and then also keeping it flowing down here. There's some junior water rights holders that would not be able to use water a lot of the time if it wasn't already brought down by the Shoshone hydro plant. And it plays an important role in keeping water in the river all the way down. And then these two structures here, this is the roller dam in Tibet Canyon that diverts a good chunk of, really the majority of the irrigation water in the Grand Valley, and then the Grand Valley Canal, which is just downstream from Palisade. So between the two of those are called the Cameo Call. The Orchard Mesa Irrigation District infrastructure is over here as well, and they're all tied together a lot. So you can see also this irrigated land. So that's where we're taking water out of the river and putting it on the land. So these are all ways that we have altered flows in our river in order to do the other things that we want to do with that water, and that affects the flows that we see. So if you flip over to the Gunnison River Basin, some of the key areas there, you can see that this area in the Uncompahgre Valley is the biggest area of irrigated ground. And it's also worth mentioning that, down here in the Grand Valley and also in the Uncompahgre Valley, not only do we have a bigger area of irrigated land, but we also have a lot longer growing season than those high mountain valleys like around Gunnison. So we take more water out of the river and put it on the land here. So some of the key plumbing here that's pretty interesting. Those water users in the Uncompahgre Valley, my cursor keeps on appearing and disappearing, so sorry if that's confusing. But a lot of those folks actually own water up in that whole system. They own Taylor Park Reservoir water, but then that can get moved downstream to Blue Mesa and then let downstream here. And then a good chunk of that, the stuff that's used for irrigation, comes through the Gunnison Tunnel, which that was a pretty wild piece of engineering a little over 100 years ago to bring Gunnison River water over to the Uncompahgre Valley quite a bit earlier than it would have otherwise, coming in where the natural confluence is near Delta. And then there's also Ridgeway Reservoir over here and Silverjack Reservoir. So all of this infrastructure also has influence on what we see in the rivers. And then you also see over here, you've got Fruit Growers Reservoir, there's Paonia Reservoir. So those are smaller, but they also have an influence on what we see in the river. So yeah, just looking a little bit at how that came to be, it's definitely very much related to the history of white settlement in our area. It's not at all a coincidence that the appropriation date for the Grand Valley Irrigation Canal, when they started digging that ditch, is 1882, which is the same year that the city of Grand Junction was founded. Unlike some other Western communities, people settled here for agriculture, and you can definitely see the imprint on the land. So this map that you see here is the area served by the irrigation districts in the Grand Valley. And I'm not going to get into all the detail about what that shows. This is the GVIC diversion fish ladder right there. But what I want you to notice is that this shape here is, if you could get a pure aerial view of this green splotch over here, which I took that picture from up by the Land's End Observatory on Grand Mesa, they are exactly the same. So you can, yeah, the green shape of the Grand Valley during the irrigation system it's very clearly demarcated by the service area of the irrigation canals, and it's very, very brown on the other side of that. So that just shows the kind of impact that our irrigation infrastructure has, even if you're not a farmer, on just, what the landscape looks like in the Grand Valley. And also, what folks at that time were mostly looking to the river for, which was to take water out of it and put it to use to have a livelihood and yeah, it was a very kind of utilitarian approach to the river. And the way we, that has evolved and just what it looks like on the ground, besides maps, is that you go, from the headwaters that tend to look kind of like that. And then you move down, that's a hay meadow in full flood irrigation near Gunnison. And then you go down, that's actually jumping over into the southwest. That's the Mountain Ute Farm and Ranch Enterprise. But you go down in elevation a little bit, and where agriculture is more intense, and you start seeing, big areas of irrigated land. That's that roller dam that plays such an important role in our valley. It's a cornfield near Delta. Our peach orchards near Palisade. And then after these rivers flow through the Grand Valley, they largely enter canyons, and not that much more is pulled out of them downstream from here until they get to Lake Powell. So all that activity, and I'd be willing to open it up to if anybody wants to make any comments on how all that activity of, building ditches and reservoirs and trans-mountain diversions and all of that, how that activity has affected the flows that we see in the river. Annie, are there any, let's see, I don't see any chats or Q&As. Okay, all right. Well, one of the things that we have done, there's about 500,000 acre feet a year that goes over the hill to the Front Range, and that does not affect the Gunnison. The Gunnison Basin folks have been very effective at repelling attempts to siphon off some of their headwaters and send them over the hill. So the Gunnison is not affected by trans-mountain diversions, but the upper Colorado is very heavily impacted by trans-mountain diversions. So that I believe a statistic I saw, I think at Kremling, the river only has about a third the amount of water in it on average as it would if it weren't for those. So it's pretty significant. And I do see that chat from Cy that you and your brother love growing up driving by Paonia Reservoir in the Tibet Canyon areas. Yeah, it's sometimes people don't, immediately make the connection between those features that you see on the landscape and what it means for flows in the river. But I like drawing those connections. So trans-mountain diversions is one thing. And then also, just pulling that water out for irrigation has had a big impact on flows in the river as well, obviously depleting them during the irrigation system, but then also sometimes later in the season because of return flows coming off of agricultural fields, they might actually be higher at some points during the year than they would be otherwise. Any more questions on that? So, another thing I wanted to mention too, and I don't have a slide for it, but even before all this human digging of ditches and irrigation and tunnels and all of that apparatus, we had already impacted our rivers quite a bit through the beaver extirpation associated with the fur trade. So, prior to that, there was a lot more beaver activity. So the headwaters were much more sponge-like than they are today. Fewer like just single channel streams and more wetlands. And so that it's hard to even imagine how much differently our rivers would flow if that was still the case. But that's another way that we have altered the flows that we see downstream in the rivers. So, but over time, so initially, when settlement first started happening here, we had a pretty utilitarian approach to our rivers, as most places did. But over time, what we expect from our rivers has really broadened. And I'm sure, you guys being part of Colorado Canyons Association community are pretty tapped into this new strain of values from the more utilitarian perspective to, seeing the river as a recreational asset, and also, just the importance of the environment in the river and the need for flows to sustain that. So as that's become more widespread, it has, it's thrown another wrinkle into the job that water managers have to do. And it's also affected how the flows are in our river. So this is just right in the Grand Valley, an example of people appreciating the river in a way that they hadn't before, and a minor flow alteration. But really the big story here, as far as these changing values with how we relate to rivers, and this is on a national scale related to the Endangered Species Act, is our, I guess they're not 100% endangered anymore, but endangered and threatened species in the Colorado River. So it's really kind of hard to overstate the impact of the Upper Colorado River Endangered Fish Recovery Program on the flows that we see in the river. And I think it's a pretty interesting story. So this is just a screenshot of their website, and I left the URL up there on purpose, so folks can find it later if they want to get more information. But it is a collaborative program that kicked off in the 80s to recover those species and provide endangered species coverage to water users. Obviously, all that activity that I pointed out before that was impacting the river and therefore the fish, it would be an extremely complicated and expensive task for each of those water users individually to try to compensate for their impacts on the fish. And it might not add up to very much if it wasn't coordinated. So the recovery program puts one umbrella program together to try to do a number of different things that can maximize the chance of recovery for these fish, and also protect individual water users from liability for their impacts to the Endangered Species Act. So there are a lot of different things that the recovery program does, but what's relevant to my talk today is that it establishes, through scientific studies, flow targets for both peak flows and shoulder flows, and actually also minimum flows in the river. So the way that folks work to try to hit those targets, I think, is pretty interesting. And then just a side note also, I'm a big fan of a lot of things that the recovery program has produced, but this is my single favorite publication that they put out, which is a historical account where they did interviews with a bunch of seniors, and this was quite a few years ago. So folks that could remember in the early 1900s, how people related to these fish that are now endangered. And they actually played a pretty major role in nourishing families while they were waiting for the irrigation projects to get built, and so that they could get their livelihood in other ways. But anyway, it's a great publication, and I encourage you to check it out. And just kind of brings to life the history of how things have changed, and how our relationship to the river and the critters in it, which have been residing there for about 3 million years, has changed in the last 100. So now we're in this whole world of working to try to manage flows for the environment. And so this is this picture on the left, I pulled from one of the recovery program reports, and I'll leave it up here for a little while so you can take a look. But as much as all that infrastructure I talked about earlier has had impacts, negative impacts on the flows in the river, and therefore the habitat for the fish, in some cases, at least some of those reservoirs can now play a helpful role in terms of targeted releases to try to help hit those flow targets. So this is upper basin wide. Oops, I didn't mean to go forward there. So you can see on the Colorado River, there's the 15-mile reach is a critical habitat area that's below the big ag diversions and before the Gunnison River comes in. So this doesn't go into very much detail on how reservoir releases play into the program there, but there's actually in the summertime and during the irrigation season, there's a weekly call involving all the water users on the Colorado River, the Trans Mountain, well, all the like big irrigation companies, municipalities, and the Trans Mountain diverters, as well as the recovery program and other stakeholders, where they talk about what's going on in the river and what the demands are, what the weather forecast is, and then the status of different pools in different reservoirs that might be able to be released if there's a need for additional flows. And in certain years, under certain conditions, they do coordinated reservoir releases to try to bump up the peak flow because it's one of the things that is needed is not just minimum flow levels, but certain peak flows to rearrange the sediments and create good spawning conditions and things like that. And also create backwater habitats for the fish. So when the conditions are right and water is available, sometimes you can coordinate releases from reservoirs along with the natural snowmelt timing to try to get the most out of that peak. And then on the Gunnison River, which is outlined a little bit more here, there aren't meetings quite as frequently, but there's also a really interesting endeavor to use releases out of the Aspinall unit to do two things. One, to meet, there's also a water right for the Black Canyon that was litigated and finally settled in 2009. So that's pretty recent that the environmental needs of the park got taken seriously and taken to court and settled. So there are certain target peak flow and shoulder flow targets for the park, which is so that would be about up here. Yeah, the Black Canyon. And then also there's critical habitat above the confluence with the Colorado for the fish. So they're trying to use the reservoir releases to hit the targets in the Black Canyon and also look at the timing of the natural snowmelt off the other tributaries to at the same time hit the targets in the lower Gunnison River, which is also critical habitat for the fish. So it's a very interesting kind of dance as far as trying to really watch what's happening with the temperatures and the snowpack and the reservoir levels and the irrigation needs and the flow targets and try to make that puzzle piece all come together. So I pulled this from, for the Aspinall unit, they have meetings where they talk about this and the public can go see several times a year and they provide great handouts. Eric Knight's in charge of that at the local office. And this is a briefing from last August. And I pulled this out to show that it's not just a uniform target, same target every year. There are different both peak duration and shoulder flow targets depending on the what kind of year it is, from dry to wet. And then that's based on the forecasts for Blue Mesa inflow. And this reflects both the reality of sometimes there's more water and less water available, but it also reflects the fact that, historically, our rivers have had super wide variations from really, really high flows, much higher than anything we've ever seen, to much lower. And so it does make some sense to have different peak flow targets in different kinds of years. So that's just shows an example of that. And this just kind of makes the point I was talking about earlier, where you have these different flows at different places. So you have, and they're trying to watch what the forecast peaks are, and then where they can release water, and kind of what it's all going to add up to down in Whitewater. So you can see this black line here is the Gunnison River in the Black Canyon, and then you add that with the flows coming out of the North Fork, and then what's happening in the Gunnison River at Delta, and the Gunnison, and then you see, you know, it all adds up into what's happening on the Gunnison River in Whitewater. And so, does anybody have any questions? I just kind of threw a lot of information at you, or any supplemental information that you would like to add. You seeing anything, Annie?
I am not. Something that you made me think of, it's not exactly a question for you, but I would say seasonal variability that we're experiencing now has been something that at our organization we have had to struggle with. In the 2023 river season, we have a river program that annually takes hundreds of youth down the Colorado and Gunnison Rivers. And this past season, we actually had to cancel trips due to high river flows, which the previous season saw cancellations due to too low flows. We were actually able to pivot one trip, I think that was supposed to be happening on the Gunnison through Dominguez Escalante, did that as a single day trip through Ruby Horse Thief, which normally is a stretch to do in 2 days, and typically we would take 3 days. So our river program has had to be very flexible and adaptable, dealing with both low flow seasons as well as those high flow seasons. And so I don't know if you have any commentary or anything to add on that.
Well, I mean, I think that's partly, you know, if you look at the long-term history of our rivers, that's kind of par for the course, that you can go from really high to really low. But that is also with climate change, I think we're seeing more of a likelihood at both, more frequency at both ends of those spectrums. It's just it's like all the extra heat just kind of supercharges the water cycle in a way. So you have, when it's hotter, you have more evaporation. So you dry up the land and the snowpack and all the plants like that much faster. You can have a flash drought. But then that warmer atmosphere can also hold more moisture. So then you can get these incredible atmospheric rivers that then just, dump much more than we're used to, and harder rainfall than we're used to. So we are seeing more of both kinds of extremes.
We do have another question that came in, or looks like a couple. How do the stakeholders resolve disputes in managing flows?
Well, it's not a free-for-all. They don't get to vote, exactly. There are there are a couple of things. The sideboards, I would say, on how to manage these flows are the water law system. So the water rights that folks have on the one side of it, and then also the flow targets are set through the programmatic biological opinions that the recovery program has put together. So that is, and then there are certain pools of water that are available in reservoirs. So there's some discretion at how to manage the flows, but it's definitely constrained by what the water rights are, and what the flow targets are. So I'm not sure if that 100% gets at it, but yeah, and there's a little bit of wiggle room within water law too, as far as how when folks choose to make a call or not. One of the things I forgot to mention on the Gunnison River that's pretty important is that one of the most senior water rights on the Gunnison is at the end of the line at the Redlands Water and Power Canal. So that keeps that calls more water downstream than would come down otherwise. It ensures certain flows in the river.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm sure you could, there could be a whole lecture about water law and how those disputes are resolved. We have a couple other comments and questions. So just a comment that CPW has seen some success in habitat improvement for the threatened and endangered fish species expanding upstream to delta on the Gunnison.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a good news tidbit. I think maybe if you could just speak a little bit more about how there is that management for the environment on the use of dams and reservoirs to adjust for the extremes.
Yeah, there's well, it's interesting the conflicting desires that we have for the river because, I mean, just in strict habitat terms, there's like the high flows are generally great as far as providing the backwater habitat and great conditions for new cottonwoods to sprout and all that. But we've been living here a while and we've built a number of things nearby the river. We have infrastructure and communities that we don't want to flood. So that and just our hydrology. So those two together reduce how much we want to, how high we want to let the flows go. So sometimes we use our reservoirs to try to, not as much as in the past probably, but sometimes we use our reservoirs to try to prevent flooding also, to maybe not augment those peaks if they're already high enough and save some water for the later on in the irrigation season instead, or also to sustain the flows later in the season for the fish as well. So there are those competing demands, but having some reservoirs on the system does allow some degree of taking the edge off both the potentially flooding flows and the really low flows. The thing is, we don't they're not that big of reservoirs. You get a couple of dry years, you see how low Blue Mesa can go, right? So it can take one or two dry years in a row. The reservoirs can help supplement those flows to a certain extent, but then if we get too many dry years in a row, they can't really do much.
Yeah. And then we have another question about water quality. So are there any interesting or concerning trends when comparing water quantity and quality? For instance, does non-point source pollution peak with runoff? Or are there predictable times or seasons where water quality is low at the same time when runoff is low?
There's an interesting relationship between flows and water quality, because it is true when there's a lot of when the flows are really high and the high runoff is happening and or like during a big monsoon downpour, you do see a lot of turbidity in the river, and probably whatever pollutants are on the land are going to get washed into the rivers. But that's also like a lot of sediment and turbidity in our rivers. That's part of the historic condition. I mean, that's we're a desert landscape. And so, when it rains, when the snow melt is happening, it's normal and healthy for our rivers to reflect that. And sometimes, if I'm driving up I-70, I look in the river and it's like, oh, it's really red. If I knew the landscape better, I would know what rainstorm, where that rainstorm was that made the river that color instead of the, browner color it was after a different rainstorm. So usually in our area, high flows and water quality, it's a good thing generally. Complicated if you're trying to take water out of the river and do something with it because there's more sediment to deal with and just debris in the river. So it's complicated, but it's generally healthy. We see more water quality problems at the low flows And that is in a couple of different dimensions. When the flows are really low, the water tends to heat up. And then also, if it hasn't rained for a long time and the water is not cloudy enough, the combination of that heat and extra sunlight tends to make algae bloom more, and that can be problematic. And then also, any pollutants that are in the river don't get diluted as much. So low flows are usually more problematic for us in terms of water quality. Another interesting impact of all the engineering we've done on the landscape with water quality, many of you are probably aware that the soils in both the Grand Valley and the Uncompahgre Valley a lot of them are Mancos shale soils that have a lot of salts and another element called selenium in it, and they're naturally occurring. But what did not historically naturally happen is to dump as much water on those soils as we do now. So when water percolates through those soils and returns to the river, it takes much higher levels of the salt and selenium into the river than historically would have existed. And salts generally are a problem for downstream irrigators, and selenium is a problem for fish and waterfowl. And they both get into the river in the same way, essentially. And any serious scientists are going to cringe at how much I'm oversimplifying. But there's also been a lot of that phenomenon is a big reason why so much of our irrigation infrastructure has gone from open dirt ditches to lined ditches or piping. A lot of that has been paid for through salinity control program funds that's partly funded by the federal government and downstream states because they want to get water that they can actually use that doesn't have as much salt in it. So lining those canals and piping laterals and things like that can reduce how much deep percolation takes that extra salt and selenium into the river. So, and the trends have been, it's been having an effect. The trends have been improving on that.
Yeah, that's great. The plumbing is working in our favor.
Well, it helped us cause the problem, but
yes.
then like, tinkering with it is helping us address the problem.
I think that's it for questions right now. So if you want to continue, and we can then have another round of questions at the end.
Sure. Let's see, okay, there we go. So we have a couple of challenges going on, and we've already alluded a bit to one of them. With climate change, we definitely, Colorado River Basin wide and also in our area, we have been seeing hotter temperatures and lower flows in the river in general. Also, sometimes some more extremes in the other direction, but the general trend is downhill. And then so we've got climate change, and then we also have just a purely human invention, which is the way that we have divvied up water in the Colorado Basin as a whole, which was that we over allocated it. So I'll get into the dynamics of both of those a little bit. This slide here, it's been around and made the rounds for a long time, but that's because I think it's especially useful. This is, there's a few different versions. This one is, they all come from Brad Udall, who's at Colorado State University. And this is from a presentation he gave in 2018 at the Upper Colorado River Basin Water Forum. So what we have here on the top here, we have Colorado River flows. So you can see the jaggedy line is the year-to-year flows. And you can see that it's always been, or, as long as we've been keeping records, which is not actually all that long, but it's, it's been variable, ups and downs, pretty deep lows, pretty high highs. To make a little bit more sense, we have these blue lines that kind of smooth out that variability. So you can see the shorter term trends and then the dashed line with the longer term trends. So you can see that that's sort of the flow history here. And then I'm going to jump down to the bottom here, and you can look at the same time the records that we have for precipitation. and they're also extremely variable. But the trend is not as noticeably down. In fact, it's a teensy tiny bit up. So you can see here in the 1950s, which was a period when the flows were low, you can look at the precipitation, and the precipitation was also lower. So that's the kind of, what we would typically expect, that you have a drought when you don't get enough rain and snow. But then we move forward and we look at the 2000s drought, and you can see flows again are down to a similar degree as they were in the 50s. But if you look at precipitation, it's not down nearly as much. It's actually, there were 2002 was really, really dry, but on average, it wasn't that much drier than the long-term average. But what was different in the 2000s was the temperatures. The temperatures were much higher. Back in the 50s, in the dry drought, the temperatures were not all that different than average, and even a little bit lower. But during the 2000s, the temperatures have gone up. So that's where, when you have those hotter temperatures, for however much precipitation we get, we even if it doesn't change very much, we can still end up in a pretty deep drought because you get increased evaporation and transpiration. So just the landscape and all the water bodies dry out a lot faster, and all the both the natural vegetation and the plants that are being irrigated to grow, they just use a lot more water when it's hot. So that's this relationship here. That's troubling because all the climate models, there's just a new climate assessment for Colorado that got released yesterday that I haven't had a chance to look at, but previous ones have been kind of all over the place in predicting precipitation trends. Not a clear picture there, but there's pretty much unanimity that we have been getting hotter and we're likely to continue getting hotter. So that means it's likely that we're going to continue seeing lower flows in our rivers, and probably need to be prepared for that. So we have a shrinking river because of that, and we over allocated the river that we already had. And this, I'm stealing some slides from the Colorado Basin Roundtable that were put together, I think with SGM's help a few years ago. But this is like, I gave you a super quick course on Colorado water law in just a few sentences. And now this is a half a slide crash course on the law of the river. So the 22 compact that divided up the flow, the rights to the Colorado River between the upper basin states of Colorado and Wyoming, Utah, New Mexico, from the lower basin, which is Arizona, New Mexico, and California, split it in half back in 1922. So they said, okay, 7.5 for the upper basin, 7.5 for the lower basin. Later on in 1944, we decided, well, yeah, Mexico can have some too. So that adds up to 16.5 million acre feet. And if you look at the long-term average going back to 1875, here's the compact signed in 1922. That orange line shows the long-term average. We really only ever had an average of about 15 million acre feet of water in the river. And that's shrinking. It's been less than that for the last couple of decades. So that's a pretty big challenge too. And so that's at the root of the news stories that you see about renegotiating the guidelines for how to manage Lake Powell and Lake Mead, and the need to cut back our water use. So one of the challenges of the situation is that when you've had in legal language since 1922, these allocations, people get pretty used to those, pretty wedded to those, and it's really hard to think about giving up some of that right. even if it doesn't exist as wet water in the river anymore. So there are a lot of negotiations going on right now between the states to figure out how to deal with that. And I think with that, I will stop sharing and be happy to take any questions or have any more discussion.
Okay, great. If anyone has more to add, please feel free to put it in the chat or the Q&A. Hannah, during your kind of response to that question about water quality earlier, it made me wonder, being from Ohio and the Great Lakes region, eutrophication is a major issue there. I wonder, is it even possible for eutrophication to happen on a river such as the Gunnison or Colorado? Is it still considered that, or is it just algae blooms that don't quite reach that same degree of a problem?
Yeah, I think well, we've been lucky that I don't think we've gotten to eutrophication in dead zones. But that's partly, I mean, I think it can be a problem in lakes that are more
Mhm.
stagnant. Um, I haven't heard of that, but I would not be surprised to hear that that has been an issue in some lakes. But it generally is not an issue in the flowing water, even in the Mississippi Basin. It's down, in the Gulf, where
Yeah,
the fallout from that happens.
yeah.
But nutrients are something that people are paying a lot more, starting to pay more attention to now in our rivers as well. Yeah.
Yeah. We have a question to please speak to the improvement in salinity in the lower Gunnison.
Um, I can't speak to it a lot. I just know that I have seen presentations from the USGS that did show positive trends, that it's getting better, but I'm not sure where that is, and that information is it's a few years old. So I'm not sure exactly where we're at now. But I do remember that some of the big contributors were, in addition to ditches and things like that, like unlined ponds were a big one. And then I think they would see a spike also if, someone um, topped off an adobe and put a house and a big lawn on there and started irrigating. That's when you see the big spikes, is at places that have been dry this whole time and not irrigated. If you start dumping a bunch of water on that soil, then that's like, it can mobilize a bunch of stuff that hasn't been mobilized before.
Yeah, thank you. We'll give it another minute for some more questions. I feel like I had something and it just left me.
Well, I can also, I mean, since I kind of just put the problem slides in and I didn't put any solution slides in. So, I mean, I do think that there are some encouraging developments in terms of work that's being done to build some additional resilience to be able to handle these hotter, drier conditions. In the headwaters area, some of the stream restoration efforts to kind of mimic beaver activity to slow down the water and spread it out. And then if you're really successful, maybe the beavers move back in and maintain it for you. So kind of re-wetting the sponge in our headwaters areas, I think, has a lot of resilience benefits. And then in the agricultural sphere, there's a lot of experimentation going on with alternative crops and different irrigation technologies that I feel like have a lot of promise, both to take pressure off the rivers and increase the resilience of our ag production.
Yeah, I think that's touching really well what you just spoke about on a new question. How encouraged or discouraged are you with the negotiations between the states relative to water allocation and usage? And to what degree do you see additional policy related to ranching and crop irrigation influencing the outcome?
Um, well, it's been kind of discouraging the last like year or so since we had whenever we have a good snowpack, it seems like people back off the solutions a little bit. Um, but and there's been a lot of finger pointing, but I think that I think with that, just like in 2021, when both reservoirs were so low, I do think that it has finally sunk in for everyone across the basin that we just can't keep going on. And it is the majority of the overuse is in the lower basin. They've gotten very used to having these big reservoirs upstream from them, and they just, they have their allocation, they have their contracts, and the Bureau delivers it, and you just get used to a very steady, and it's on a really large scale there too. So that's been really hard to put a dent in, that sense of entitlement, I think. And just like, oh my goodness, but it would be such a big change to ratchet that back. But they have started to. It's baby steps. It's not enough, but I feel like they're coming to terms with the fact that they will actually have to do that. In the upper basin, our leaders keep making the point that nature curtails us on a regular basis, which is true, but are also recognizing that both for our own benefit and to play our role in getting the system back in balance, that we do need to make more investments in these resilient strategies. And the 2024 program of paying folks to cut back on water use, the applications for those just came out, and a bunch of people did apply to try different strategies, whether it's fallowing fields to get ready to try to plant something else that might use less water over the long term, or just trying something different. Quite a few people did apply, so there's experimentation happening there. In the policy realm, and related to ranching and crop irrigation, I think we're in a realm of, I don't see any new policies that would mandate cutbacks coming back, other than just, our prior appropriation system. If you're junior, if there's not water in the stream, you don't get it. I mean, that's the way we've historically cut things back, or nature has cut us back. I see policies going more in the direction of incentives and tools and flexibility to either lease or donate water to streams or to other water users. So I would expect to see more tools emerge and more people using those kinds of tools to move water around, to share, hopefully in beneficial ways. That are beneficial for the whole system. And then I see this next question here about large wildfires introduced additional challenges to endangered species. I actually have not heard of impacts from the Pine Gulch fire to the recovery program, to the endangered species. I know it had to have had a big impact on I watched videos of the flash floods coming down and all the debris. And I know in other places there have been major fish kills from wildfire debris. I actually haven't heard of any fish kills from that one, any big ones anyway, on the main stem. So yeah, but it makes sense that large wildfires, it's definitely can be a major water quality impact. And I know Clifton Water had to cut off their intakes. They take water out of the Colorado River for drinking water, and they had to just cut off their intakes to the river for a while, and U-Water served their customers. So, but I think it was relatively transitory, and then they were able to start using the river again. So that's a great question, but I don't actually know.
Yeah. I know we had another fire this past season, the border fire that was along the Colorado in Ruby Horse Thief. Basically, it was right at the edge of Mountain Island Ranch, I think is the name of it. And so that's another just burn scar very close to the river at this point. So I'll be curious to see if anything comes of that this spring.
Yeah, it's so sad to see, like in Tibet Canyon, there was that fire a few years ago, and you still drive by and see those cottonwoods. Cottonwoods do not recover well from fire. So yeah, it adds extra impetus to any efforts to control tamarisk, because tamarisk, among other things, is really good at intensifying wildfire and coming back from wildfire and taking the wildfire from the low grass level up to where it can torch the cottonwoods. So
yeah.
That's a problem.
Yeah. Well, I think we can probably end it there. Thank you so much, Hannah. I want to give a little bit of a plug just for anyone feeling motivated after this lecture to get involved in some stewardship. Through CCA, there's a couple different projects that come to mind. First off, we do annually host a river cleanup, one in the Colorado through Ruby Horse Thief and one on the Gunnison. And that is a volunteer project. If you are not already signed up to get our volunteer newsletter, you can go and find that on our website to get information about those restoration projects, as well as some others that might be coming out this year related to river habitat restoration or wildfire mitigation or some of these other topics that we mentioned. If you feel more inclined to educate others about issues such as water quality and how we all need to be cooperating to manage our water resources, you can volunteer to come to an education event with me and work with local youth to talk about these topics. We have an annual sixth grade field trip that actually happens down at the Cottonwood Grove Campground in Gunnison Gorge National Conservation Area. We have fish and wildlife folks and BLM fish folks who come out and actually shock for native fish, and you get to see some of these endangered species. Not endangered species, actually, I don't think they bring them up. But some of these native fish that have been in the river for millions of years, and some of these fish that are, affecting this policy and the flows in the river. We also talk to the kids about these competing interests in river flows and how all of these various interest and user groups must cooperate in order for all needs to be met. So quick little plug, sign up to be a CCA volunteer, and you can either do some hands-on, boots on the ground work, or come and educate some younger generations with me. So Hannah, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us this evening. This lecture has been recorded, and so I'll be emailing out the recording tomorrow. That'll be on our YouTube channel. And be on the lookout around fall of next year or of this upcoming year for additional lectures. Thank you so much, Hannah.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. It's been fun. And thanks for caring about rivers and all that you do.
Absolutely. All right, with that, I'm going to end the recording and end the meeting. Enjoy your night, everyone.